it looked really horrible for me. And yeah, the mortality rates that were sort of that came after those massive spreads of diseases reached from 50 to 90% population loss. And one of the examples include smallpox epidemic that happened in the second half of the 19th century that killed thousands of indigenous people. And in my theory, that was one of the tools that they used deliberately to sort of facilitate colonial expansion and weaken indigenous population. The next thing is land dispossession. Between 19th and 20th century, Canada signed the number of treaties. By the number of treaties, I mean like treaty number 1, treaty number 2, number 4, and so on. Here you can see treaty number 6, under which colonizers covered large areas of Alberta and Saskatchewan. Right now, those two are the provinces of Canada. And they also promised education, medicine, and support for Indigenous, but those promises were frequently ignored or underpaid. Here also you can see the flag of Britain. Yeah, and here you can see the picture of Indian and Indigenous and sort of white person, which shows sort of illusionally that they were sort of settling peace and so on, but those treaties that they promised were frequently ignored and underpaid, as they promised education, medicine, and so on for Indigenous people. This is the map of Canada. You can just see here that Alberta, Saskatchewan, those large areas were covered. And as far as I'm concerned, as far as I know, in British Columbia, there's a bunch of residential schools that we will be talking today also. And Quebec, that was colonized by France. The Indian Act, sorry, I will come in 3 minutes, seconds. Sorry. Now, the Indian Act, this is one of the most powerful things that they imposed. Basically, this was the policy that centralized colonial control and included bunch of restrictions. One of the restrictions include Indigenous people sort of asking government permission in order to leave reserves or move from one place to another, which was also common to Kazakh people, as they were a nomadic nation. And the main goal of this Indian Act was to control over not only Indigenous land, but also their lives, their culture, and also bans of cultural practices were also included into this policy. Now let's talk about ban of cultural practices. In the previous lecture, we talked how Nowruz, which will come soon. All right, Nowruz was banned in 1926. Here we can see that several cultural practices were banned, such as potlatch and sun dance. You can also Google this up. Here you can say the objects that they used, this dance, and those were the important ceremonies and traditions for the Pacific Northwest culture. So basically, each nation, Indigenous tribe nation, had their own unique cultural practices that also shows that they had diverse cultures. Now, if you went against those policies and that banned those cultural practices, then you would be imprisoned, or those objects that they used for ceremonies would be confiscated from them, including their own personal things. Sun dance was also part of this, and you can see that the bans were recent. as potlatch was banned in 1884, Sundance was banned in 1885. So this was the sacred ceremony that was practiced by by specific nations in Canada. Now let's talk about one of the most horrible things that happened as a part of cultural genocide, which is residential schools. Those schools, and they had the whole system that were operated by the government and Christian churches, mostly Catholic, by the way. And those residential schools operated from for almost a century, and from 1920, which is one of the amendments to Indian Act that we already talked about, included policy about that the attendance of the school was mandatory for children, for Indigenous children specifically, aged 7 to 15. So they didn't have a choice to whether they could attend the school or not. They were forced to attend them. And also, parents who refused to give their children away, give the children up to this system, would be imprisoned or killed in some cases. Here you can see, do you know Anne with an E? This is a popular Canadian movie among teenagers, and on TikTok as well. So here I think in last season, this girl appears. She's Indian, and she was also taken to residential schools. Her parents, nor this girl, the main character of the movie, they had no idea of what were the conditions in those residential schools, and they thought that they were doing right things by giving their children to learn English, to be educated in other things. But you can see here that they were forced to wear uniforms, that their braids, the haircut that was also a part of their culture was erased, and so on. And also, I think we don't know the ending of this girl in the movie, which just shows the part of the fact that she might be killed, or which proves some of the cases that occurred. We will talk about this. Now let's talk about oppression in schools. As I said, and no, I didn't mention this, but speaking Indigenous languages was forbidden in those schools. So if you spoke your own language, your tongue would be pinned, in some cases. And in this movie, this girl, when she speaks her language, her fingers are cut, literally. This just shows the scope and the violence towards children, not just Indigenous people, but also towards children, basically. And also, if you came with your brother or with your sister, with your sibling, basically, you would be separated. I guess this was part of the, they thought that you would be talking with your sibling in your own language, and in order to prevent that, they would separate you, which is also part of cultural genocide. And traditional clothing, as we can see here, she had a beautiful clothing, and that was taken off, and she was forced to wear uniforms. And they also spoke not only English language, but also French, and forced to adopt Christian religious practices, as you can see here and here. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And let's talk about the major consequences that led to death in some cases. For example, many children were buried in unmarked graves near schools. And by the way, in some cases, children would be committing suicide, according to some survivor stories. and according to some survivors that shared their stories to make Canadian mainstream medias. Yeah. And this is the evidence from Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It was like recent, you can see here, not recent, okay, 10 years ago, but still, there were confirmed deaths that were estimated to sort of to 4,000 and more children. And those children, most of those were buried in unmarked graves near school, which meant that in some cases, parents didn't know that their children are dead, which is also crazy. And also, I would like to mention that there were some cases of sexual violence, also according to survivor stories. And those causes that led to death included malnutrition and physical abuse. Malnutrition, there is also a book by the residential school survivor. She's Indian, basically, yeah, obviously. And that book is called They Call Me Number One by Bev Sellers. She talks about how bad food was in residential schools. So there was some food that was pretty much like uneatable, and that would hurt their nutrition system and so on. And they couldn't eat that. But if you didn't eat, you would be punished, basically. So those things also happened to them. Now let's talk about the third thing, or the fourth thing, which is the 60s Scoop. This thing, similar to this, not necessarily like the 60s Scoop, but the similar thing happened in the United States, similarly to to Indigenous people as well. Basically, to the 60s, according to this policy, Indigenous children would be forcibly removed from their families and placed into white ones. Here you can see that there were newspapers saying, adopt Indian Métis children, adopt this, or a child is waiting, and so on, which shows that the white host families would, in some cases, adopt their those Indigenous children, or they would be kidnapped by government or something like that. There were lots of children affected, which estimates to up to 25,000. And yeah, as I said, they were adopted into non-Indigenous families, which most of them were white. Consequences led to loss of language, obviously, cultural identity, and long-term psychological trauma, because you were literally separated from your family. Also, the picture of this is not seen, but I read the story about this girl. Well, she's a grown woman right now, and she shares her story to CBC, which is a mainstream media in Canada. She talks about how she felt lonely in that family that adopted her, and that she felt that she was not fitting into to this family and to to those things. I think the motives for that included, as I said, loss of language, so that those children and this new generation of people fully assimilated to the British culture, or something to British people's way of living, basically, and so on. Now, the last thing that I would like to talk about is the language loss. As I mentioned at the very start, almost 70 or more indigenous languages existed in Canada, and they were spoken before colonization, before 1500s. And today there are only three languages survived, and you can see Inuktitut, Cree, and Adrip, and they had large speaker populations. Basically, I think those tribes had most of the people, and most of the people were included to those tribes, and that was the reason those languages survived, basically. And other languages have fewer than 500 speakers, or in the bad case, those languages do not exist anymore. And residential schools were also a major factor in this linguistic decline, as I said, because they were punished for talking and speaking in their language. In some cases, your hand would be cut, or they would pin a pin to your tongue if you talked in your language, which is also crazy. You can also, I cited the art work here. You can read the story behind that. Yeah. And the major consequences included, as you can see here, we already saw this here. Those are the shoes, I think, of the residential school children that were that died during that period, or committed suicide, whatever. And we can see how Indian people still sort of go through this intergenerational trauma, and they basically have seen that their languages were being lost, and that they were forced to assimilate to another culture, which is also challenging for the people that really like practicing their cultural things, their traditions, and to speak in their language. And also, I would like to mention one thing. In most cases, colonizers, not in most cases, but in Canadian and I think basically in American cultural genocide, mostly they used children, because those are the vulnerable part of population, right? They were more easier to control, because if you forced adult people to speak your language, then they would be protesting, right, in some cases, and mostly. But children were more vulnerable, and they didn't know what's wrong and what's right, and that's why they were used in order to quickly impose this assimilation in Canada. And we can see the consequences here. Those photos are recent, and people still live up through this trauma. And here is the basic conclusion of this lecture. I didn't talk about forced sterilization, but this was also the part of cultural genocide and happened mostly in Alberta, here, this province of Canada. And we can see how abuse and deliberate abuse, both sexual, physical, and psychological, mental, towards Indigenous children, ban of cultural practices, and sort of this deliberate oppression towards language proves that it was both a biological, physical, and cultural genocide. This was not only cultural genocide in case of Kazakhstan, because apparently some people still debate whether famine was a genocide or not. But in Canada, it is strongly, people do not debate about this. I think also Canadian researchers were activists and advocates in the fact that cultural genocide became an official term of this. Yeah, and that's all. I will send this presentation to the group of my permanent members, and we'll also ask SMM team of association to send this. Thank you for attending my lecture, and this was almost the last lecture. If you attend the last one too, on the next Tuesday, then you will be, I think, getting certificates from association. That's it, basically. If you have questions, you can also ask. Oh my god. Sorry. If you have questions, you can ask, basically. Yeah. So there are no questions? Okay. Yeah, this is pretty much it of the course. We will be doing comparative analysis of different cultural genocides that we talked about, that include Uyghur genocide, this one, Kazakh genocide, genocide in China, and Korea, and all of those things. In Australia also. So that's it. Thank you for attending my lecture. I will see you hopefully on the next Tuesday.